Okay, I'm on page 16 and I'm going to get as far as I can get today. It is Sunday. It's actually my day off. It's my pajama day and I have a neuroscience class coming up in 40 minutes. So I'm going to get through as much of it as I can in the next few minutes and we'll see where I get. So this is page 16C. The defendant aimed deceit at the targeted states to alter their ascertainment and appointment of electors. Shortly after Election Day, the defendant began to target the electoral process at the state level by attempting to deceive state officials and to prevent or overturn the legitimate ascertainment and appointment of Biden's electors. As president, the defendant had no official responsibilities related to the state's administration of the election or the appointment of their electors, and instead contacted state officials in his capacity as a candidate. Tellingly, the defendant contacted only state officials who were in his political party and were his political supporters, and only in states he had lost. The defendant's attempts to use deceit to target the state's electoral process played out in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, that's my state, so he personally tried to steal votes from me, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, as well as across these and other states that use certain voting machines. In addition to the following evidence of the defendant's conduct during the charged conspiracies, at the trial, the government will elicit testimony from election officials from the targeted states to establish the objective falsity and often impossibility of the defendant's fraud claims. Notably, although these election officials would have been the best source of information to determine whether there was any merit to specific allegations of election fraud in their states, the defendant never contacted any of them to ask. And by the way, everybody testifying in this are all Republicans. So these are all every testimony in this. There's not one Democrat because he wasn't enlisting Democrats to help him with his scheme. Also, I will say this, I have a new list of potential who the CC1s and P1s and all that is. So this could change from the first video that I created because people keep finding more evidence and more things. And again, it's all allegedly because we don't know who, like we don't know who P16 is. Let me just see. P16, according to this, is Arizona Governor Doug Ducey. All right, so one, Arizona. The defendant was on notice that there was no evidence of widespread election fraud in Arizona within a week of the election. On November 9th, for instance, 2 days after news networks projected that Biden had won, the defendant called Arizona governor, and that was Doug Ducey, Governor Doug Ducey, to ask him what was happening at the state level with the presidential vote count in Arizona. At that point, though Fox News had projected that Biden had won the state, several other news outlets, including ABC, NBC, CNN, and the New York Times, had not yet made a projection. So Governor Doug Ducey, P16, walked the defendant through the margins and the votes remaining to be counted, which were primarily from Pima County, which favored Biden, and Maricopa County, which was split. P16, Doug Ducey, Governor Doug Ducey, described the situation to the defendant as the ninth inning, 2 outs, and the defendant was several runs down. The defendant also raised claims of election fraud, and P16, Governor Doug Ducey, allegedly asked the defendant to send him supporting evidence. Although the defendant said he would, stating we're packaging it up. He never did. So Donald Trump never sent evidence to the governor and to the officials that he was asking for help with this. Shortly thereafter, on November 13th, campaign manager P2, Bill Steppen, told the defendant directly that a false fraud claim had been circulating, that a substantial number of non-citizens had voted in Arizona was false. The same day, as noted previously, campaign attorneys conceded in court that the remaining election lawsuit in Arizona was moot. So his own campaign attorneys admitted in court that it was a moot point. They had no evidence. So again, up here on page 17, you can go through some of the different evidence right there. So he's got it all in there. The defendant and CC1, this is not. So the defendant and CC1, which was Rudy Giuliani, continue to try to influence P16, that's Governor Doug Ducey. For example, CC1, Giuliani, tried to contact P16, Ducey, on November 22nd, the same day the defendant and CC1, Rudy Giuliani, reached out to the Arizona Speaker of the House, as described below. And on November 30th, the day P16, Doug Ducey signed the Arizona Certificate of Ascertainment, formally declaring Biden's electors as the legitimate electors for Arizona. P16, Doug Ducey, received a call from the defendant and Pence. P16, Doug Ducey, advised that Arizona had certified the election. When the defendant brought up fraud claims, P16, Doug Ducey, eager to see the evidence, asked again the defendant to provide it, but the defendant never did. Instead, later that evening and into the following morning, the defendant repeatedly publicly attacked P16, Doug Ducey, as well as the Georgia governor, Brian Kemp. We know that was the Georgia governor at that time, so we can assume that P17 is the Georgia governor, Brian Kemp, on Twitter, retweeting posts by others such as "Who needs Democrats when you have the Republicans?" like P17, Brian Kemp, and P16, Doug Ducey. Watching the Arizona hearings and then watching Governor P16, Doug Ducey, sign those papers, why bother voting for Republicans if what you get is P16, Doug Ducey, and P17, Governor Kemp? Governor Kemp, my state ran the most corrupt election in American history. P16, Doug Ducey, hold my beer. And why is P16, Doug Ducey, still pretending he's a member of the Republican Party after he just certified fraudulent election results in Arizona that disenfranchised millions of Republicans? So that's what Donald Trump said. He said he was calling these people out on Twitter. He was calling these people out and basically falsely claiming, because he had promised them that he was going to send them evidence, but he never did. And then when they did certify the election, which was not fraudulent, there's no evidence that there was any fraud whatsoever, including in the over 60 court cases that Donald Trump took to the courts, included Republican judges. So like everybody that's claiming that it's all bias, well, 100% of the courts can't be biased, right? And many Republicans are coming out now saying this is not okay. But, he's calling all of them rhinos if they don't go along and step in line with his fraud. All right. So the defendant and the co-conspirators also attempted to use false fraud claims to convince political allies in the Arizona state legislature to ignore the popular vote and appoint illegitimate electors. On November 22nd, the defendant and CC1, Rudy Giuliani, called P18, Rusty Bowers, Arizona House Speaker, allegedly the Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives. CC1, Giuliani, did most of the talking. During the call, the defendant and CC1, Giuliani, levied multiple false fraud claims, including of non-citizen, non-resident, and dead voters that affected the defendant's race, and asked P18, Rusty Bowers, to use them as a bias to call the state legislature into session to replace Arizona's legitimate electors with illegitimate ones for the defendant. When P18, Rusty Bowers, voiced his deep skepticism, CC1, Giuliani, said, well, we're all kind of Republicans and we need to be working together. P18, Rusty Bowers, refused and asked CC1, Giuliani, to provide evidence supporting his fraud claims. CC1, Giuliani never did. So again, never provided any evidence, never provide anything for that fraud. So indeed, CC1, Giuliani met with P18, gotta keep looking, that's Rusty Bowers, in person approximately a week later, and still had nothing to back up his claims. On November 30th, CC1, P12, CC1, Giuliani, P12, Jenna Ellis, and others arrived in Arizona for a hotel hearing, an official meeting with Republican legislatures during which they promoted false fraud allegations. In a meeting the day after the hearing, when state legislatures pressed CC1 Giuliani and P12 Jenna Ellis for the evidence to support their claims, CC1 Giuliani conceded that even on that late date, he said, in quotes, "We don't have the evidence, but we have lots of theories." When the legislators were frustrated that CC1 Giuliani had no support for his claims and asked him tough questions, CC1 Giuliani expressed surprise at the way he was being treated, stating, "Man, I thought we were all Republicans. This is a little more hostile a reception. I'm amazed at the reception I'm getting here." On December 4th, P18 Rusty Bowers released a public statement in which he explained that he did not have the authority to use the legislature to reverse the results of the election, and that doing so would constitute an attempt to nullify the people's vote based on unsupported theories of fraud. This is a Republican stating this. P18 Rusty Bowers made clear that he was disappointed with the legitimate election results because he voted for President Trump and worked hard to reelect him, but would not violate current law to change the outcome of a certified election. And notice the people that didn't break the law aren't being indicted right now. On Twitter, P19 Christina Bobb, a campaign staffer who worked with CC6, that's Boris Epstein, and attacked P18 Rusty Bowers for his statement, writing that P18 Rusty Bowers is intentionally misleading the people of Arizona to avoid the inevitable. The defendant retweeted, boy, I'm having trouble with that word today, P19 Christina Bobb false post and praised her. So the defendant, Donald Trump, retweeted a false post by Christina Bobb and praised her for that. A month later, just 2 days before January 6th, CC2 John Eastman, another defendant's private attorneys and a co-conspirator, he's been indicted, called P18, and P18 is Rusty Bowers, and P18 Rusty Bowers counsel. P20, which is Corey Langhofer, which is Bowers' lawyer, and urged P18 Rusty Bowers one last time to use the legislature to decertify Arizona's legitimate electors and overturn the valid election results. When P18 Rusty Bowers told CC2 John Eastman that there was no evidence of substantial fraud in Arizona and that he could not legally call the legislature into session, CC2 John Eastman was undeterred. He conceded that he didn't know enough about the facts on the ground regarding fraud in Arizona and said that P18 Rusty Bowers should nonetheless falsely claim that he had the authority to convene the legislature and let the courts sort it out. P18 Rusty Bowers again refused. In the post-election period, P18 Rusty Bowers was harassed. On several occasions, individuals gathered outside P18 Rusty Bowers' home with bullhorns and screamed and honked their vehicle horns to create noise. Once, an individual in visible possession of a pistol and wearing a t-shirt in support of a militia group came onto P18 Rusty Bowers' property and screamed at him. At the time of these events, P18 Rusty Bowers' daughter was at home and was very ill, and the noise caused her disruption and angst. Man, sad. Like, that's so sad. Okay, Georgia. Number 2, Georgia. The defendant had early noticed that his claims of election fraud in Georgia were false. Around mid-November, campaign advisor P4 Jason Miller told the defendant that his claim that a large number of dead people had voted in Georgia was false. The defendant continued to press the claim anyway, including in a press appearance on November 29th, when he suggested that a large enough number of dead voters had cast ballots to change the outcome of the election in Georgia. I will just say that they did find some election fraud on that aspect, and it was Republicans. Go look it up. There's court cases. I've read those too. It's absolutely insanity. 4 days later, 4 days later, on December 3rd, CC1 Giuliani orchestrated a presentation to a judiciary subcommittee of the Georgia State Senate. In the morning, in advance of CC1, Giuliani had spoken to the defendant on the phone for almost 20 minutes. And at the hearing, CC1 Giuliani arranged for co-conspirators and agents to repeat the false dead voter claim. The claim was so patently false that everyone around the defendant knew it. During the hearing, Chief of Staff, P21, that is Mark Meadows, and P9, Eric Hirschman, exchanged text messages on their personal phones confirming that a campaign attorney, P22, Alex Cannon, had certified that CC1 Giuliani claim of more than 10,000 dead voters was false and the actual number was around 12 and could not be outcome determinative. During the subcommittee hearing, the co-conspirators also set in motion a sensational and dangerous lie about election workers at State Farm Arena that would result in the defendant's supporters harassing and threatening those workers. Those two ladies, that is the saddest court case. If you really want to just be in tears, read that court case about what those two women went through. Unbelievable. So first, P23, Ray Stallings Smith III, one of Trump's Georgia lawyers, one of the defendant's private attorneys, claimed that more than 10,000 dead people had voted in Georgia. Next, P24, Jackie Pick, an agent of the defendant, played misleading excerpts of closed-circuit camera footage from State Farm Arena and insinuated that it showed election workers committing misconduct, counting suitcases of illegal ballots. Lastly, based on the false fraud allegations, CC2, John Eastman, who had already been engaged as a private lawyer for the defendant but did not disclose that at the hearing, encouraged the Georgia legislatures to decertify the state's legitimate electors. While the hearing was ongoing, the defendant simultaneously amplified the misinformation about the State Farm Arena election workers, falsely tweeting, "Wow, blockbuster testimony taking place right now in Georgia. Ballot stuffing by Dems when Republicans were forced to leave the large counting room. Plenty more coming, but this alone leads to an easy win of the state." He did this just after retweeting two of his campaign account's tweets that promoted the false claim about election workers at State Farm Arena. Over the next week, the claim of misconduct at State Farm Arena was disproven publicly as well as directly to the defendant. The day after the hearing, P25, Gabriel Sterling, the chief operating officer of the Georgia Secretary of State's office, posted a tweet explaining the Secretary of State officers had watched the video in its entirety and confirmed that it showed normal ballot processing. P25, Gabriel Sterling, again forcefully debunked the co-conspirators' claim about the State Farm video in a press conference on December 7th, explaining at length the election workers' innocent conduct depicted in the closed circuit camera footage and stating, and what's really frustrating is the president's attorney had the same videotape. They saw the exact same things the rest of us could see, and they chose to mislead state senators and the public about what was on the video. I'm quite sure that they will not characterize the video if they try to enter it into evidence, because that's the kind of thing that could lead to sanctions because it is obviously untrue. They knew it was untrue and they continued to do things like this. On December 8th, the defendant called Georgia Attorney General P26, Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr, and so P26, Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr, had advance notice that the topic of the call was Texas versus Pennsylvania, an election lawsuit in which Texas was suing other states, including Georgia, to attempt to prevent the certification of the election. U.S. Senator P27, that's David Perdue, and told P26, Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr, that the defendant had heard that P26, Chris Carr, was whipping or lobbying other state attorney general against filing amicus briefs in support of Texas. P26, Chris Carr, was not lobbying against the suit and told P27 U.S. Senator David Perdue. So David Perdue asked P26 Chris Carr if he would speak with the defendant about it, and P26 Chris Carr agreed. Shortly thereafter, the defendant called P26 Chris Carr and immediately raised Texas versus Pennsylvania, saying, I hope you're not talking to your AGs and encouraging them not to get on the lawsuit. P26, Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr told the defendant that he was not affirmatively calling other state attorneys generals. But if they called him, excuse me, he was telling them what he was seeing in his state, which was something that the defendant probably did not want to hear. P26, Attorney General Chris Carr told him that the state authorities had investigated the State Farm Arena allegations and found no wrongdoing, and that he thought another claim the defendant raised about Coffee County, Georgia, had been similarly resolved but would check. The defendant asked P26 to look at them again because we're running out of time. P26 tried to steer the call to an end by thanking the defendant and telling him that he had voted for him twice and appreciated the defendant, to which the defendant responded, yeah, I did a hell of a job, didn't I? At one point, the defendant raised with P26 the impending runoff election for Georgia's U.S. Senate seats and how important it was to re-elect P27, David Perdue, and P28, U.S. Senator Kelly Loeffler. The day after the call, the defendant, in his private capacity as the candidate for president, intervened in support of Texas versus Pennsylvania. His attorney for that matter was CC2, John Eastman. Whew, boy, oh boy. On the same day as the defendant's call with P26, Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr, the defendant's campaign staff acknowledged that the State Farm Arena claim was unsupported, emailing one another about the fact that television networks may decline to run campaign advertisements promoting it. In frustration regarding the claim and others like it, P4, Jason Miller, campaign advisor, who spoke with the defendant on a daily basis and had informed him on multiple occasions that various fraud claims were false, wrote, when our research and campaign legal team can't back up any of the claims made by our elite strike force legal team, you can see why we're 0 to 32 on our cases. I'll obviously hustle to help on all fronts, but it's tough to own any of this when it's just conspiracy shit beamed down from the mothership. Oh boy, he said that. Wow. On December 10th, however, CC1 Giuliani further perpetrated the false State Farm Arena claim when he appeared at another hearing, this one before the Georgia House of Representatives Government Affairs Committee. During it, he displayed some of the same footage as had been used in the December 3rd hearing that had been debunked in the interim by Georgia officials, and nonetheless claimed that it showed voter fraud right in front of people's eyes. He then named 2 election workers, P29, Ruby Freeman, yep, and her mother, Shay Moss, P30. And that I can almost guarantee that that's who it is, because those are the 2 ladies that sued Rudy Giuliani and won and proved that they weren't doing anything false. These were volunteers. These were people that they had to go into hiding, these ladies, because of violent supporters and just off of lies. Like he does not care who he hurts. He doesn't care. Anyway, he then named 2 election workers, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, and baselessly accused them of quite obviously surreptitiously passing around USB ports as if they are vials of heroin or cocaine, and suggested that they were criminals whose places of work, their homes, should have been searched for evidence of ballots, for evidence of USB ports, for evidence of voter fraud. As these claims about P30, Shay Moss, and P29, Ruby Freeman spread, the women were barraged by racist death threats. In the years since, they have spoken about the effect of the defendant and co-conspirators' lies about them. As P30, Shay Moss explained in an interview with congressional investigators. When someone as powerful as the President of the United States eggs on a mob, that mob will come. They came for us with their cruelty, their threats, their racism, and their hats. And they haven't stopped even today. Even today, these women are dealing with it. And Rudy Giuliani owes them millions of dollars and is like ducking it, trying not to pay it because of the harm and the lies that he told. He continued on. He continued it. Um, Still, none of it touches Trump. Indeed, to this day, the defendant has never stopped falsely attacking Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, P30 and P29. Although none of the false claims against them were ever corroborated, the defendant has continued to levy them on social media, including when the defendant attacked P30, Shay Moss, in January 2023, just after her testimony to congressional investigators was made public. Throughout the post-election period, the defendant used Twitter to publicly attack Georgia Governor P17, Brian Kemp, with particular aggression. In the 35 days between November 30th, 2020 and January 3rd, 2021, the defendant tweeted critically about P17, Brian Kemp, by name or title more than 40 times. These tweets included the ones also attacking P16, Arizona Governor Doug Ducey, described above, as well as others particular to P17, Brian Kemp, like, why won't Governor P17, Brian Kemp, the hapless governor of Georgia, use his emergency powers, which can be easily done, to overrule his obstinate Secretary of State and do a match of signatures on envelopes? It will be a goldmine of fraud, and we will easily win the state. I will easily and quickly win Georgia if Governor Brian Kemp, P17, or the Secretary of State permit a simple signature verification. Has not been done and will show large-scale discrepancies. Why are these two Republicans, in quotes, saying no? If we win Georgia, everything else falls in place. The Republican governor of Georgia refuses to do signature verification, which would give us an easy win. What's wrong with this guy? What is he hiding? And how does Governor P17, Brian Kemp, allow certification of votes without verifying signatures? And despite the recently released tape of ballots being stuffed, his poll numbers have dropped like a rock. He is finished as governor. Boy. In the post-election period, the defendant also made false claims in court about fraud in Georgia unsuccessfully. For example, in Trump versus Kemp, a federal lawsuit in which the defendant sued Georgia's governor and Secretary of State, the defendant signed a verification of fraud allegations that he and his attorney on the case, CC2, John Eastman, knew was inaccurate. Now, I believe John Eastman has lost his law license due to some of these false claims that he brought on and signed on to because he was knowingly, falsely signing papers that he knew was not true. P9, Eric Hirschman, spoke with the defendant and CC2, John Eastman, in the late December regarding the proposed verification. First, he told CC2, John Eastman, and another private attorney, P31, Cleta Mitchell, was a Trump Georgia attorney, that they could not have the defendant sign it because they could not verify any of the facts. And P9, Eric Hirschman, told the defendant that any lawyer that signed the complaint that the verification supported would get disbarred. CC2, John Eastman, acknowledged this problem in an email on December 31st to P32, Kurt Robert Hilbert, who's another Trump attorney, lead counsel for the defendant as candidate in Trump versus Kemp, and another private attorney writing that in the time since the defendant signed a previous verification in the case, he had been made aware of some of the allegations and evidence proffered by the experts has been inaccurate, and that signing a new affirmation with that knowledge and incorporation by reference would not be accurate. Nonetheless, on December 31st, the defendant signed the verification, and CC2 John Eastman caused it to be filed. So they signed it and they filed fraudulent papers anyway. I gotta go here soon. Let me just see if how much I can get. I'm on page 28. Let's see. I'm gonna stop there and I will try to come back later. So we're gonna start on, we just finished page 27. We're gonna start on page 28. Whew, boy, guys, like this is clear. This evidence is very clear, and it's all verifiable through tweets. Like, it's all public. Like, this is public stuff. There was no election fraud. He tried to file false electors. He created a board of false electors and tried to have them replaced. The plan was to get Mike Pence on January 6th to insert the false electors instead of the actual electors. And all of those electors are now they're all in court cases. They're all in trouble. You know, it's unbelievable. Tina just got served 9 years in prison for this stuff. This is just absolutely, like, if I wasn't reading this, it's crazy. It's just incredulous. And there's so much of the population that has believed his lies, and it has corroded our belief in our democratic system. And I think that is actually evil. I'll be back.